Hi, listeners. This is the 80,000 Hours podcast, where each week we have an unusually in-depth conversation about one of the world's most pressing problems and how you can use your career to solve it. I'm Rob Wibland, Director of Research at 80,000 Hours. The Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security is one of the top global institutions working to prevent health disasters, both by shaping the development of new technologies and shaping government policy. As you'd expect, they've been working their asses off on COVID-19 lately, but they've also really been preparing for this moment for over 20 years. So I was excited to interview Tara Kirk Sell, who did her thesis on misinformation during disease outbreaks, and has worked at the center for over a decade since completing a very successful career on the US national swimming team. If you're as keen on the center's work as I am, you'll be glad to know that as of a few weeks ago, you can directly donate to the Center for Health Security through the website for the Effective Altruism Funds, which plenty of you are already signed up to. The EA Funds site also recently added the option to give to the Biosecurity Program, the Nuclear Threat Initiative in Washington, D.C. The Effective Altruism Funds system also supports donations to their 4 expert advised funds and direct donations to 28 other organizations that might be popular donation targets for listeners to this show. 3 projects on the list have actually already been featured on previous episodes. There's the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters, also known as AllFed, the Wild Animal Initiative, and of course GiveWell. It's operated by our fiscal sponsor, the Center for Effective Altruism. Note that 2 of the expert advised funds have made grants to 80,000 Hours before. Naturally, we'll link to the site in the show notes. All right. At the end of the show, I'll have a few random book recommendations for you all. So if you've enjoyed my past suggestions for things to read and listen to, stick around for that. But without further ado, here's Dr. Tara Kirk Sell. Today, I'm speaking with Tara Kirk Sell. Tara completed her PhD in public policy responses to emerging epidemics at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She's now a senior scholar and assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, where her work focuses on public health policy in response to large-scale health events such as disease outbreaks, bioterrorism, or natural disasters. The Center for Health Security might well be familiar to listeners because it received a major grant from the Open Philanthropy Project, in part to expand its work on global catastrophic biological risks, which we discussed with the center's director, Tom Inglesby, back in episode 27. Among other things, Tara has studied communication in Ebola and Zika outbreaks and is a co-principal investigator for the center's Disease Prediction Project, an online platform to collect forecasts about disease outbreaks and test their accuracy. She contributed to Public Health Principles for a Phased Reopening During COVID-19, Guidance for Governors, which came out just last week. She also happens to have won a silver medal at the Olympics swimming in the women's 4x100 meter medley relay. And most impressively of all, back in 2008, she was a contributor for episode 18, season 6 of the US version of What Not to Wear. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Tara.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
We were going to speak last month at EA Global San Francisco, but then suddenly somehow that got cancelled, I guess along with every other conference in the world. But I'm glad we can now finally have a chat about the thing that caused our previous interview to get cancelled.
Mm-hmm.
But first, our usual opening question is, what are you doing and why do you think it's very important work? I guess I might be able to guess what you're working on at the moment, but it'd be interesting to hear more.
Yes, it's definitely COVID-19 all the time. I guess I should start out and say that the Center for Health Security has really been following COVID-19 since the very beginning of the outbreak. I've been working on pandemic preparedness for about a decade. And so it's really crazy to me to think, hey, this issue that we sort of worked on and thought about as the future is now here and something we have to deal with now today, and that everyone's talking about it. Everyone has an opinion. My parents have an opinion they like to tell me all about. And so, it's strange, but I think, working on these pandemic issues has now shown to be, incredibly important. It affects our everyday lives. And, hopefully that work will help us get through this, or at least help us get ready for next time.
What are your parents' policy suggestions?
Well, at first it was really funny because they're older and I kept saying, really, you should stop going out, stop going to the fabric store, stop going to get groceries twice a day. And they were very resistant. And now they're completely flip-flopped and they don't think that anything should reopen for a really long time. And I mean, I'm glad that they're taking it seriously now. So that's good.
Yeah. I think I had a similar experience. My mom's initial reaction was, just let it go through. It's going to be too much trouble to try to stop it. But I think she's changed her mind since then.
Yeah.
Is CHS doing anything that's non-COVID related now, or is it just kind of eaten up the whole organization, at least for the next few months?
COVID-19 has really taken over everyone's lives right now. I think we've been trying to keep up our work on a couple other things, but I mean, it's hard even to just read your emails
Yeah.
at this point. So I have a couple projects. My misinformation project that I was doing for Ebola has, it's been published now. And so we're kind of shifting that over to COVID, but, at least we were able to finish that out. So a few things that aren't COVID related, but not that many.
Yeah. All right. Well, speaking of COVID, let's start by talking about misinformation, which has been, I think, one of your main research interests. If I remember right, your PhD was about kind of media and policy interactions during Ebola outbreaks in Africa?
Yep.
What has surprised you about kind of the nature or the extent of misinformation that's going around about COVID-19? Is it kind of more or less than you'd think, or is it about what you would have predicted?
So misinformation is something that we see all the time. And we've also seen these disinformation campaigns that have really started to move into public health. There was a paper in HAPH about Russian trolls and the vaccine debate. So I'm not surprised that we've seen this level of mis and disinformation in this outbreak. I'm glad that people are paying more attention to it. I think it is a huge opportunity to sow division in the American public and, lead to a lot of lack of trust, which to me is really concerning. So I think, the themes we saw for the Ebola outbreak, we see those exact same things now. You could almost just take the disease name out and replace it, and you see many of those same themes. So, that wasn't surprising, but the extent to which we're seeing it, I guess, is something that's new and interesting.
Yeah, so you mentioned kind of active disinformation campaigns. I'm curious, what misinformation about diseases, where does it typically come from actors who are trying to sow discord and coming up with clever disinformation to spread? Or is it just like people who don't have a clue about medicine who say stupid things?
I think it's both. I mean, misinformation is when you talk about something, it's not supported by the evidence, it causes people to have the wrong belief, but it might just be a mistake, right? Yeah. Or the wrong interpretation. Disinformation is more purposeful. And, that is definitely happening. I don't want anyone to be uncertain about that. Those things are definitely happening. And this is an opportunity for, foreign actors to really cause problems in the U.S.
Yeah. How do you measure the scale of disinformation? And is it possible to tell, I guess Russia would be an obvious candidate to be doing that, but are there others as well?
I mean, I don't want to point fingers without evidence, but I think that, there are countries that have sophisticated abilities to do this type of thing. And so I think that it's more than just Russia.
Yeah.
Oh, you asked how to measure. Do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah. How do you track it?
Yeah. So we tracked misinformation and we didn't differentiate between disinformation in that case, but we tracked that in tweets about Ebola. And we found that about 10% of tweets had either misinformation or were misinterpretations of true information. And so, 10%, is it high? Is it low? I don't know. If 10% of tweets out there are basically false, then maybe that's a problem, but it's not like taking over, the communication landscape.
Yeah. I kind of wish that only 10% of tweets were false. I think some of the tweets that I see, I think probably more than 10% are not that good.
Yeah.
My amateur impression is that there's I suppose I don't live in the US, but at least it's in the UK. It seems like kind of most people are on board with the lockdown. Most people think that COVID-19 is a serious problem. I guess I wonder how many practical challenges has this misinformation or disinformation actually created so far? And might we expect it to get worse as people get more sick of being confined to their homes and are open to alternative narratives?
Yeah, I do think that it's going to get a lot worse. I think that in the U.S., we're currently at risk of losing about half the population, the trust of half the population, and the belief that, these public health interventions are actually worthwhile. I mean, misinformation, the thing that it does, it makes you, lose trust in authorities, and you're not as willing to comply with some of these public health interventions that you don't really like. And so, I think that there is a moving narrative now that this isn't worth it. And so, I am worried about the rhetoric that's kind of emerging. And I think it's going to be a really tough couple of weeks, coming up.
Yeah. To what extent do you think people are mistrustful of authorities because they have actually just been wrong or slow to respond to this? So I guess it's like authorities have changed their mind on masks. It seems like for a while they were saying, there's not going to be a big problem, but then it turned out to be much worse. And so maybe people are kind of reacting saying, well, actually, perhaps the federal government or some of these agencies really aren't that trustworthy.
Yeah, well, so I teach a risk communication class, and I'll be honest, the federal government has broken pretty much every rule when it comes to risk communication. So they were slow, sometimes not credible, changing their minds, not consistent, all the things that you kind of hope that public communicators don't do was done in this outbreak. And so I think that people have lost a lot of trust. But I think the thing that's really important is that, we're all in this together. So if half the people don't really believe what's going on, that's a big problem, right? It's not just, oh, you can do whatever you want over there. I think that it's something that we should all care about.
Yeah, I saw I think when you were studying Ebola, I saw some stat that said 25% of people in the DRC think that Ebola isn't a real disease. How big a problem is that for trying to control a pandemic over there? And can they show us how big a problem it might be over here if people are not bought into it?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. So if you think, okay, we have the perfect countermeasure, or like the right vaccine, the right treatment, we have the exact thing that we know exactly what people need to do, and they just need to do it, right? And if you can't communicate and you can't get people to trust you that what you're talking about is actually real and what you're trying to tell them to do is actually useful, you might as well not have anything at all, right? It's not worth it. So that's such a critical component, that trust and that communication.
Well, what are the people who don't think that Ebola is a real thing? I mean, have they not seen anyone have the disease? It seems like it's quite a noticeable disease, right? Well, seems like it would be hard to deny that it exists.
It might be noticeable. They might attribute it to other causes. There's all these conspiracy theories that happen in every outbreak. So I don't know what specifically was happening there if they didn't see it. But in the U.S., you're stuck in your house, or other parts of the world for COVID-19, you're stuck in your house. You might not see anyone getting it, and so it seems very distant.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned that some of the US authorities hadn't really been following best practice in terms of communicating about COVID-19. It seems like it would be it's a very hard challenge to communicate well to the public, who's a very diverse group, especially when you have lots of active groups out there trying to spread disinformation and trying to kind of take advantage of any mistakes that you make. What can organizations do to protect themselves and do a good job in such an environment? It seems pretty messed up.
Right. It's always tough, especially, when you say, okay, you have to communicate quickly and you have to also be right.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's really hard to do together, right? So, the other thing you can do is say, here's what we don't know. Here's what we're doing to find out that information. And here's how our plans might change if we found that information out. But I think the critical thing here is to be transparent and not try to spin anything, because I think people are smart enough to realize when you're spinning them. And so, I never would recommend trying to cover anything up when it comes to communication.
Yeah. What kind of spin are you talking about? Are you trying to explain that things are better than they actually are, or trying to pretend that you know things that you don't?
I think it's trying to pretend that things are better than they are, or over reassuring. That just down the road ends up biting you, because, the truth comes out and then it is worse than you said or whatever. And I think that then people lose trust. They don't want to listen to you anymore.
Yeah, that seemed to be an issue early on. Well, back in January, it seemed like the mainstream line among experts was, oh, don't worry about it. Not that many people have it. Like, more people die of all of these other things, which seemed really misleading to me, because obviously the concern wasn't that lots of people were dying of the disease, in late January. It was that many more people would get it in future. And so saying, oh, don't worry, don't panic, just seemed like it was completely missing the point. And then, of course, it was setting them up to have to do this 180 a month or two later when it became much more common. Did you also think that it was a bit odd that people were trying to play it down so much early on?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it was a huge, I was really concerned about trust, even back, early in February when people were playing it down. How could anyone imagine that you've got it all over China and showing up in Europe, that it wouldn't come to the US, that it wouldn't spread all over the world? That's just common sense, right? I mean, no travel ban is really going to be able to actually prevent that. It was, in the US already very early on. And so the idea that you didn't have to pay attention to it and it wouldn't actually spread seems to me crazy.
Yeah, but so it seems like it wasn't only, you might understand politicians who don't know very much about diseases, who are trying to just put a positive spin on things because that's the instinct that many politicians have, perhaps. But it seemed like it was people who are more informed, like epidemiologists, or people who do actually understand diseases or medicine, who people were turning to for advice, and they were saying, "Don't worry about it." What was going on in their minds? Why did they think this was a good move?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not as familiar with everyone who was saying, "Don't worry about it," but I was in my little cocoon of people at the center who thought this was a big deal. So I don't know what was happening, honestly. I do think, though, that there were people saying we shouldn't panic. And I certainly think that is the correct message, that we should be thoughtful about how we move forward, and that, we need to collect this information so we can make the right moves. I don't think that was a problem. But yeah, I guess I wasn't that familiar with many people who were saying, don't worry about this at all, other than politicians.
I think part of what was going on was perhaps people wanted to promote this idea of don't panic because they were worried that the public would panic. And they felt that the way to do that was really to talk down the risk a lot. And then it kind of got a bit out of control. I'm not sure how big the risk of, or it seems like what's ended up happening is much worse than the public panicking in January. We could have like done with a bit of panic. That's like, panic is really not that big deal. Or maybe I just haven't seen what happens when the public really panics, but because people panic later and it wasn't that bad.
Well, in the academic world, we try not to say that people will panic because people are acting in ways that are rational considering the information that they have most often, at least. I mean, a few times you can have instances of people not acting rationally. But for the most part, if there are information voids or there's, the sense that things are getting out of control, then people will act in more intense ways. And so, that's what happened because people were, over reassured and then had this sort of smack them in the face.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that I guess one way for authorities to protect their credibility is to admit what they don't know. But I suppose there's kind of a difficult trade-off there because I suppose admitting what you don't know, maybe that makes some people trust you more because they're like, oh, they're being sincere about what they don't know. And it makes it easier to then change it, to say something different later on because they say, well, we previously didn't know, now we do, and you're not doing a backflip. But I suppose saying that you just don't know lots of things might create this void where people then like start looking for alternative authorities because they're saying, well, if the CDC doesn't know all of these things, that's not very satisfying to me. I have to find someone else who's going to give me answers, like maybe false answers. But yeah, is there a difficult line to tread there, conceding what you don't know versus saying nothing?
Yeah, I think it is difficult for anyone. But I think what you could say is here's what we think right now, but there's a lot of uncertainty about it. And here's what we're doing to sort of reduce that uncertainty. And so the answers may change. I think a lot of it's just framing and sort of admitting that maybe you're not an expert or you don't have that level of understanding. I think that's fine personally, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah. Are there any countries that have done a good job, misinformation or communication-wise?
I was really impressed with the Prime Minister of Singapore's sort of just the messages that he put out. They were like video messages and they were incredible when it comes to risk communication. They were sort of explaining everything I've said here on what you should do in risk communication and did a great job of foreshadowing how they might change things coming forward. So I was incredibly impressed by that.
Yeah, maybe we'll stick up some links to those videos. Sometimes when I was feeling anxious about the situation, I would go back to YouTube and rewatch some of the videos of him explaining what things are going on. They're just like, yes, like a source of common sense and like calmness in the eye of the storm.
Exactly.
It's like, put it on my mental health rotation. What should we think about misinformation that comes from government? Is that something that we should understand in the same way that we do other misinformation, or is that something that needs to kind of be studied within a different framework?
Yeah, misinformation can come from governments. I'm not going to try to cover that one up. It certainly can happen. I think that, it's possible that people can sort of make mistakes or that information can change over time, but, it can come from companies, people, governments, whatever. It can come from a variety of sources.
Do you have any view on what the internet companies should do? I noticed that YouTube and Facebook and, well, actually so many sites now, they've got these banners at the top where they're trying to direct people towards authorities on coronavirus, which I guess it's the public health people in the UK. I suppose over there, they're linking maybe to the CDC. Is that a good step? Or do you think that people who kind of reject the mainstream narrative are just going to reject those pop-ups as well?
Well, I do think that those efforts are really valuable and the changes to the algorithms that they've made can make a big difference. But I agree that, if you're someone who rejects mainstream science or the authorities, then that's not going to be helpful to you. And so I think this is where research comes in and trying to understand the best ways to access these populations who are sort of distrustful of authority. I think that the answer to the problem of misinformation isn't necessarily that the tech company should solve it all for us. Like, I certainly don't want Facebook to determine for me what's true or not. And so I think that, there's a lot of stakeholders and I think members of the public also have to take a hard look in the mirror and understand and figure out how we're sort of figuring out what information sources to trust. And I think that, there's a whole lot of stakeholders who need to think about it.
Yeah. Have you seen this paper about, it's a little bit dark, but it's, I guess, differing mortality rates from COVID-19 in different districts of the US, depending on whether they watch Tucker Carlson, the Fox News host, more than they watch Sean Hannity?
I mean, I saw the abstract to that. I mean, I think it probably has to do with how quickly you were interested in social distancing, although it could also have to do with the demographics of, how old you are and if you're able to social distance. I don't know the demographics of those two shows.
Yeah. Just for listeners, they looked at different counties, I think, in the US, seeing whether people watched the Fox News host Sean Hannity or Tucker Carlson more. Tucker Carlson spent most of February saying that COVID-19 was going to be a massive problem. Sean Hannity spent most of February saying that it wasn't going to be a problem at all. And they noticed that places where people watched Sean Hannity more, the fatality rates were higher or more people had died of the disease. I suppose I've seen enough empirical social science to wonder how good are the methods there. Like if you went past the abstract, would it really hold up? But I mean, if it's correct, it suggests that it's kind of startling Do you think Sean Hannity, like, in a sense, people will have died, his viewers will have died, potentially, because he got this wrong? And I wonder how much people will feel that sense of responsibility in the media to get things correct.
I think the media should feel a responsibility to get things correct. But in this case, I don't think that was right. And I think it was pretty bad.
Yeah. How can people figure out who to trust? I suppose, especially if they want to just go beyond, like, the highly confirmed facts that the CDC is putting out, and they want to, like, stay abreast of kind of cutting edge science in it. Yeah. What are indications that are hard to fake that something is actually credible?
So, it's hard because if you're looking at preprints, you have to have sort of an understanding of how those methodologies work. And if you're not in that field, it's hard. Even I'm in public health, but I mean, I don't know how to parse exactly, what to be worried about in particular in like a modeling study. So I think, trusted mediators are definitely important there. There can be some leading journalists who seem to have really gotten things right. But also, I don't want to plug our stuff too much, but I don't have anything to do with the CHS COVID newsletter, but I think it is excellent. And, I get a lot of information from that and try to follow a couple other, news sources. But I'm also just like run over with so much information. I think that's a huge problem that's happening for everyone right now, is that there's just too much to absorb. And so, it's kind of, I think it's called data deluge. And I just have a hard time even keeping up with my emails. So try to get what I can as the world is moving at lightning speed.
Yeah. I had that experience in late January, early February. I felt like I could kind of keep up with what was being learned about COVID-19. And then just in March, things snowballed so quickly. I wasn't even able to keep up with the articles that people were literally emailing me. And so rather than just randomly start reading through them, I was just like, I give up. I can't keep track of this. I'm just going to, like, stop trying to be at the cutting edge and just learn things a month late, and that's going to be fine. So, I mean, yeah. maybe that's a sensible approach, because there's so much going on that really all you can do is specialize in some, like, narrow area and really understand that. And a lot of the rest of it is just kind of has to pass you by.
Yeah, I do think, some things you're just going to have to say, I'm going to delete that from my inbox. But I think that, I think one thing that can be really interesting now is that there is more information coming out about what's happening in localities and what's happening on the ground. So, like, my colleague Amish Adalja, he's a clinician. He also works at CHS. And so, I really value his perspective because it's kind of, first person. And I think the more that we're able to understand sort of what's happening in localities based on the information that's coming out of them, I think we'll have a better picture of what's happening rather than these large countrywide sort of models or whatever that I think don't have enough granularity to really tell us that much.
Yeah. I'll just plug, Scott Gottlieb, who contributed to a paper that came out last week about what governors should do, and Helen Branswell, who's a journalist at Stat Magazine. Actually, Stat Magazine as a whole has been pretty impressive, I think, in covering this. I guess it's like a kind of industry magazine for pharmaceutical companies or for the medical industry. And I guess it really does help when journalists have some expertise within the domain in which they're writing, which is not always the case. But it means that I think they've been able to cover stuff that other places have not been able to make sense of.
Yeah, she has been great. And then Scott is also, he has a very sensible voice. So I'm glad that he's been, publishing and pushing things out.
Yeah. Are there any institutions in the US that have kind of overperformed how well you thought that they would go? And perhaps should they be given more authority to play a big role in future pandemics?
I was really impressed with the King County Public Health Department. They were the first to recognize it. I thought they were really on their game. I thought they were approaching some very sensible, solutions, trying to think through things with the understanding of local conditions. So I was very impressed with them. I think that some states have also done a very good job. I think that when we talk about risk communication, I think that risk communication from Governor Cuomo has been excellent. And I also think that, Governor Hogan in Maryland, where I live, he was on his game very quick. And I do think that has been, the states have shown leadership, whereas, we had some disappointing efforts by the federal government.
Yeah. Do you think more power to respond to pandemics should be devolved down to the state level, or I suppose, more local levels in other countries as well? Or does that just create other problems?
Well, in the United States, it varies based on home rule versus Dillon's rule. Who has the power? Is it to the locals or is it to the state? I do think the states have done a good job, and that the more local you can get, the more responsive you can be. But that spreads out sort of response resources. And in some cases now we have states actually banding together to kind of, put their resources together. In an ideal world, I think the CDC would be empowered to, do the great work that we know that they've been capable of in the past. right now they've been a little bit silenced. And, I think that, it's important to have a really strong federal public health agency. So kind of a middle of the road answer there, I guess.
Yeah. I guess I've heard a lot of respect for the CDC in the past, but most people seem to have been disappointed with their response to this one. So did they not have the right people? Or was it political interference in the CDC that made them hard to do their job?
Well, I feel the same, and I don't really know exactly what has happened. I used to work with a lot of people there, and I still work with some of them. There has been, over the past few years, many people have retired, some people who I think had a lot of institutional knowledge and a lot of capability to, manage a pandemic. So I think that there has been a loss there. I don't know exactly what happened, and I don't know if we'll ever know, but certainly the efforts with regard to testing were pretty disappointing.
Yeah. Yeah, speaking of testing, do you have any view on the FDA and their performance? I've seen a lot of people who've been kind of angry with them for seemingly holding up advances in testing or in other medical equipment that maybe we would like to roll out with a lower level of testing or confirmation of how well it works and safety testing and so on, because this is an emergency situation.
Yeah, I've seen that criticism as well. I think it's reasonable, that criticism. I don't get too involved in what's going on FDA. It, to me, is sort of a black box. It's very difficult to understand what's going on there.
Yeah, interesting. There's been some disappointing things in the US, but if you look at the number of deaths across the country as a whole, the amount of contagion across the country as a whole, it actually doesn't seem to have done that much worse than many other countries, at least on a per capita basis. It hasn't done well, but it's not as if we can say, oh, this is all like the US federal government's fault. It's like other countries have often done similarly badly, despite not having, whatever the unique issues are with the United States. And so it seems to me like around the world, governments have been pretty slow to react to this, potentially being weeks behind where they could have been if they were very proactive. And I wonder, what's the reason that governments tend to lag in their response? Why aren't they running ahead of it? I suppose one thing is you get this kind of exponential growth where in order to get ahead of where the virus is, you have to suddenly 10x your response 1 week to the next because it's amping up so fast. And maybe bureaucracies aren't designed to do that, or people just don't want to believe that things are going to be so bad. But it seems like there's potentially quite deep-seated factors that cause things to happen too slow.
Mm-hmm. I think, there's a number of things happening here. One is that, the reluctance to admit that something really bad is coming down the road. I think the other is, I think that taking action has its own costs, right? If we had started saying we're going to close all businesses and do all these things without, our testing actually in place, and we had zero, very few cases, I think it would have been hard to justify that, even though we know that there were cases all over, we just weren't testing very well. So, it's a mix of things. And certainly, it was a difficult situation, but I think that it would have been better to have testing set up earlier so we knew what was going on earlier. We're not trying to sort of pop in the middle of, an epi curve and try to figure out where we are. I think that would have made a big difference. And so I think that was part of the slow reaction, but I think another part was just reluctance to sort of do the things that were hard.
Yeah, I guess there's this interesting paradox that I suppose closing down the economy, it's very hard to get broad-based support for that until more people have died, until things are going worse. But of course, by the time that's happening, then now you have to close down the economy for much longer to bring down the case numbers sufficiently. I suppose you can see the example of other countries going really badly. Like in a peculiar sense, like Italy was very helpful for the rest of the world because seeing the carnage there really prompted other people to say, oh my God, we're going to be that in 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah. So when Italy happened, I said, whoa, this is actually, a country that has advanced medical care can't handle this. And, we knew that it was going to be bad, but Italy, it really showed how the case fatality rate changed when you didn't have appropriate medical care and you had an older population. And so I think Italy was a big wake-up call to say, this isn't just, less than 1% case fatality. This could be bad if you're not able to actually handle it with your health system. And that was sort of the wake-up call, I think, for everyone.
Yeah, there's this funny thing that I'm originally from Australia. Australia has actually done this quite well. It seems like they imposed lockdown sufficiently early that they've managed to bring new case numbers down to really low levels already. But then it means that I'm hearing from people that people are losing support for the lockdown or losing interest in it because not enough people they know have died. So it's slightly hard to maintain interest in it because they've been so successful at stopping it. I suppose it's slightly nice that Sweden, or there's some countries that are pursuing a slightly heterodox approach where they're potentially not going to have stay-at-home orders. And so we might see some more spread. Perhaps that will be an example to the rest of the world, depending on how it goes, showing this is what would have happened.
Yeah. So I think everyone's tired of being in their house. I'm tired of being in my house.
I'm tired of being in my house.
So I think it's going to be very difficult to keep up this communication and asking people to keep doing these things that they just don't want to do anymore, and that they're not seeing cases in people they know. And so I think that's going to be difficult. I don't know if people have to learn the hard way or if there are ways that we can sort of meet in the middle. I hope that that's the case. It certainly seems like, these really thoughtful approaches that public health has sort of put forward as what the gating criteria for moving forward for many states are not going to be met. And people are just going to do it anyways. So, yeah.
Interesting. I suppose, so the point of the lockdown was to bring down case numbers, also to give us time to put in place ways of dealing with a renewed outbreak, like testing capacity or more hospital capacity. Do you think that time has been used well, given how expensive it was to buy each day of delay?
Absolutely not.
Okay, go on. This sounds good. Well, it sounds terrible.
That is probably the thing that has been, I guess, most infuriating actually about this outbreak, that, we knew it was happening in China in January and nothing was done to sort of really actually make measurable changes on the ground in the US to get ready for it. And then we had it happen in the US and we all went into lockdown at, as you said, immense cost. Incredible cost to ourselves right now and to our kids in the future. I mean, this is going to be a big problem for a long time. And, still, for us, 6 weeks go by and I don't see huge improvements in testing capacity, in the serology, in PPE, in hospitals, in hospital capacity. Like, these things are just haven't happened. And that, I was sort of wishing that we could have timelines where we say, this is what we're going to do by this date. And here's the person responsible. And we're going to, take names until we get it done. I would have liked to see a little bit more urgency in, saying each day is a livelihood, and many livelihoods, in fact, and each day is critical that we, push our opening forward one day in a responsible way. And I just don't think that has happened.
Yeah. What do you think has been stopping it? I suppose I feel sympathetic to the people trying to do this response really quickly, because they may just not have very much experience in the area. And there's lots of different groups are competing to get protective equipment. And maybe the factory is already maxed out and there's just only so much that the world can do. But it sounds like you think that we've underperformed what is realistically possible.
I think this is a hard problem. And, I have sympathy for that. But at the same time, so is, how many millions of people we have employed. That's a big problem. We have we have many, many hard problems that we're dealing with here. And so I just think, we went to the moon, we built a nuclear bomb. Like, that's a hard problem.
Can't we make some masks?
Let's yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I guess, are there any specific suggestions of stuff that you think should have been funded, maybe that wasn't funded, or, maybe regulations that should have been loosened to make things go more smoothly that weren't loosened?
Yeah. So my public health hat on, I have to say, local public health should be funded. The funding for the FEP program, the Public Health Emergency Preparedness Program, has really declined in the past decade. Same with the Hospital Preparedness Program. These funding lines are critical and they've really lost a lot. So, that's one thing. The other thing is investing in technologies. And I think that, we do need to be able to think outside the box and sort of move a number of different technologies forward. I think this is something that the EA community can really sort of help everyone get their arms around, what kind of new things that we should be looking at. How do we change the game?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I suppose I'm very optimistic about how things are going to go in Australia, because they managed to bring down the case numbers to a pretty low level. And in the meantime, the testing capacity has gone up quite a bit. So now, like, the number of tests they can run per number of cases that they expect, at least over the next few months, is pretty good, such that they can do a lot of testing and tracing and probably keep it under control for quite a while. I guess, yeah, is it realistic that other countries could have done this as well if they'd had, I suppose, similar capability to expand their response, their ability to respond whenever the stay-at-home orders end?
Yeah. So, I mean, it looks like South Korea has done a really excellent job. They do a great job contact tracing, and they've had incredible levels of testing. They had a trial run with MERS. So, obviously they were able to test out what they were doing and improve it, and change some laws. And so I think that really did make a big difference. I think New Zealand and Iceland have also done good things. But, let's also now think about the fact that 3 of these countries are island nations with, moderate population sizes. So that makes it a little bit different. These countries have done a good job. And I think that, the US could emulate that a little bit.
Yeah. All right, let's move on and talk about the public health principles for a phased reopening during COVID-19, Guidance for Governors, which CHS put out last week. Yeah, you were one contributor to that report. What was it trying to say? And I guess, what was its most valuable contribution in your view?
So I think this report was really trying to frame different types of business or activities in a framework that was showing what the risks were as far as level of contact. So was it close contact? How many contacts there were, and then also how modifiable those contacts are. And I don't think that there was really like specific go, no go guidance on that. It was more, can we provide people with, information that they can sort of take then to a larger stakeholder group and have that discussion about, what's worth it, right? There are different levels of risk. And sometimes you might take something that might be a little bit higher risk or you have a lot more uncertainty about, like schools, and you might say, it's worth it, but it's all in a mix. It's not just public health who should be making this decision, right? It should be a mix of stakeholders who, bring their expertise into the conversation as well.
Yeah. So I guess I'd been looking for something like this, and I hadn't seen a similar report until this one came out. Maybe there was one out there that I'd missed. But I guess you're kind of trying to rate these different activities because it seems like, well, we've got this whole spectrum. Thinking as an economist, there's like activities that are create the most disease transmission per like util that people derive, which is maybe, I don't know, a music festival or something where people are in enormously close contact that are probably not super essential that people do that. And so probably we're not going to have really crowded music festivals, not going to have a mosh pit for a little while. But then there's like all the way down to things that we've already closed where they're quite important economically, like people's livelihoods are being destroyed because they're not happening, but the amount of transmission isn't that great. Like, say, going to a clothes shop that's not that busy, not that packed. I guess you're trying to draw out that spectrum and say, well, if you're going to open some things, well, here's some things that are more promising, either where the number of people you're close to is not that large or you don't spend that long around them, or you can kind of adapt the shop, say, by saying, well, people got to keep their distance, and then you can reopen the clothing stores. So, some of the interesting things was, I guess, shopping malls and retailers seem like they can reopen. I guess parks and actually non-contact sport was one we were saying, well, people could probably play tennis, right? So we could perhaps be a little bit creative.
Yeah, so I pushed for that one because as a swimmer, I was like, there's not that much mixing that's going on when we're swimming at the pool, as long as we're not breathing all over each other at the end of the lane. I think it's pretty clear that ventilation plays a really big role here. We've had some studies. I guess I saw a preprint just the other day about, the different outbreaks that they sort of tracked in China. And, for the most part, those have really come from household transmission or from transmission in transportation. And so, when people are in very brief contact outside, I just, I don't see that as sort of a huge risk. And at this point, it would be ridiculous to think that we're trying to strive for zero risk, right? No one lives a zero risk lifestyle. And so I think that we're just trying to reduce the level of risk of transmission here. So, we want to avoid close contact, and we want, not to be indoors. And I think that businesses and people can really think through those, requirements and make adjustments. And that's what I think we should really be striving for here, is that people can make these decisions based on the knowledge that they have about the disease, rather than, these overall orders that sort of compel them to do something.
Yeah, I guess, are you seeing a lot of people responding? I guess I've seen a lot of businesses and offices thinking about how can we, because they want to reopen desperately. So they're thinking, how can we reopen the office in a way that isn't going to get our employees killed? Maybe, even in some ways the government response has been a bit disappointing, but perhaps we could see quite a lot of individual responsiveness and flexibility that could allow things to return to some semblance of normality without the disease breaking out again.
Right. I do think that businesses have been very flexible and are trying to push for ways that they can do things safely. And I think that's really great. You mentioned going back to the office. I personally think that probably if you're able to work from home, that's one thing that I would say you should probably keep doing.
Okay, yeah.
If you can do that effectively.
Yeah. I guess maybe in-person things, construction, perhaps. It's like warehouses and factories and all that. Oh yeah. Also trying to figure out how they can keep running. So you said, well, we don't have much evidence of people catching it from strangers passing by them on the street or in parks or anything like that. It's mostly what in the house you're seeing and public transport are the two key vectors. It makes me wonder then.
Well, that's from the preprint.
Okay, right. Well, let's just take that as gospel. That makes me wonder. I've heard some people who have been a bit skeptical about the lockdown because they say, well, you're going to get so much transmission within the household because people are spending tons of time in close contact with their family and housemates then, that given the enormous cost, maybe it's not actually going to do as much good as you think. Do you have any view on that?
Yeah. So, I think people are already in contact with their household. And so, I wouldn't say that would be a reason to say no on lockdowns. But I do think, I'm not a fan of the, like I said, the lockdown as a coercive sort of measure. I think that providing guidance and helping people understand what should really be done is much better. So, the costs are immense though. And, having people be thoughtful about, their contacts, I think is important. But, even if the lockdown isn't happening, I'm still having my kids cough in my face. So I don't know if that's a huge difference.
I guess part of the reasoning is that as long as you're with the same people in the same house every day, they can't infect you twice. So either you get it or you don't after a while.
Right. Although we've been, we were social distancing for like 2 weeks and somehow we caught like a tiny cough.
I know.
Like my whole family. And
I've been out in the country in this house for like 5 weeks, seeing practically nobody. And like last week I got a cold. I'm like, wow, this is incredible. How is this not enough? You'd think at least if I'm meeting nobody, at least I wouldn't get colds. But no, it's not even the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's been the response to the report? You mentioned in the notes that librarians weren't pleased by the suggestion that maybe libraries are a somewhat safe environment in which people to resume normal life.
Yeah, so I wasn't really involved in this debate, although I heard from Caitlin, who is the main author of the report, that, these librarians were saying, we do have close contact with our customers or with people who are coming into the library. It's not just, if you think of it from the perspective of someone who patronizes a library, then yeah, maybe you're not coming in contact. But if you think about a librarian, then they are. And I think actually that, that's a fair criticism and also something that you could think about for every business, right? There's a lot of unique approaches to business and also varying types of contact occurring within those businesses. And so, I think an overall judgment can be helpful, but at the end of the day, that's why we want to have stakeholders involved so that they can sort of articulate those differences and bring them up as, important components of a decision-making process.
Yeah. Yeah, it is an interesting point that I suppose even in like a not crowded clothing store, for someone just going there to buy something, it's probably a pretty safe trip. But then someone who's behind the counter all day, constantly being exposed to different customers, maybe the risk really does add up, and who's going to want to take those jobs?
Right. Well, I agree. But I think people maybe sort of the unemployment's pretty high. People need to make their rent. So, then it's sort of a situation where people sort of don't have a choice.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a section in the report talking about the importance of kind of consulting with lots of people in the community before deciding what things to reopen. I suppose there's a kind of an obvious case for that, which is you want to understand people's preferences about what to reopen and I guess get buy-in from the people who are going to actually have to do these things that you're asking them to do. But as I was reading it, I was thinking it could just be that members of the community, like stakeholders in this decision, perhaps don't have the expertise to really say what activities are risky and which ones aren't, and they might pressure a politician or pressure officials to reopen something that's very important to them, not realizing just how dangerous it is. Is there a case for focusing more on people who have expertise in how dangerous a church is, how dangerous is swimming, rather than people who want to go back to swimming?
Yeah, so I think that's a fair question. I would say, though, that, decision makers need to sort of be able to understand that epidemiology, and people who want to advocate for themselves should be able to do so. And then if the decision goes against them, if they've at least been part of the conversation and had their considerations, thought about. So I think, it's not a problem to have people's voices as part of the conversation.
Yeah, I suppose as long as the politicians are also paying attention to the public health people, it's a question of balance, and then just got to make sure you don't listen to only one group. Right. Yeah, are there any things that you're worried will be open too soon?
I mean, yeah, there are things. I don't think that a close contact in bars is probably a good idea. It's an indoor environment. There are a lot of people very close in bigger crowds. I think Georgia's opening up soon. And so I think they're opening up movie theaters. That seems at first kind of dangerous, but, I think that there are ways you could modify it, right? If you had people sitting far apart. The same with the gyms, right? There's a worry about transfer via fomites. But I also think that there may be ways to modify the situation so that people are safe, and that, there are a lot of people who've been in their houses, and, we don't want to increase odds of all these other chronic diseases that can occur from sort of being very stationary.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess, coming into this, I would have thought, well, there will have been lots of studies of where people catch colds or where people catch the flu. Like, is it at the gym? Is it at the pool? Is it at the church? Is it somewhere else? But it seems like we haven't really done those studies. Or maybe, I guess, when I then think about it, I think, well, the way that you might study that is to create some new disease that's harmless and then give it to people and then see how it spreads throughout the city and where people caught it. But that may not get past ethics approval. So perhaps this is a slightly harder thing to answer than what I thought. But is it possible? Is this kind of research that we desperately need to figure out where do people get the flu the most?
It also varies by disease. Right. So then you're just not sure. Yeah. And then before it's expensive to sort of and hard to contact trace, especially if you have high levels of flu in the community. How many cases of flu do you have and how many times are you exposed? I think it's pretty tough. There have been studies to see like how long viable virus can be found on certain surfaces, but I'm not sure that those have sort of included infectious dose or, that kind of thing, or how it works actually in humidity and sunlight. So we're getting into an area that I don't know that much about, but I think that those types of things would be really helpful.
So it sounds like a lot of what we know kind of comes from the contact tracing early with diseases, where we find in almost all cases we can track it to someone living with someone or being on public transport or something like that.
Right. Yeah. And so, there may be a little bit of bias there because, it's more obvious if you have caught it from your housemate or you know what was going on in public transport. But I think that that's what I saw on that I guess I'll caveat it again in that preprint. And then South Korea has also been keeping track of these things. They had these outbreaks in these churches when there are close contact, you're, in close contact for a long time, you're indoors. So I think it's starting to become more and more clear, there may be risks about spreading the disease in other situations, but that, close contact indoors for a long period of time is really the main way that I think people are getting this disease.
Yeah. I guess that's actually a little bit hopeful in terms of maybe we can reopen a fair few things without letting our get too far above one if you need close contact.
Right. Right. I think we have to be careful, but, it's possible.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on and talk about some other things being done at the Center for Health Security. You've been a leader on this collective intelligence for disease prediction project. What is that and how is it similar or different to kind of other forecasting platforms like Metaculus or the Good Judgment Project?
Yeah, so it is actually pretty similar. Crystal Watson and I had started and done a past sort of prediction project where we were actually doing a prediction market. But it's actually really hard to have people who aren't really that experienced in it and have a different sort of infectious disease day job to do commodities trading on an infectious disease outcome. And so we switched it to sort of a platform that does a lot of the work for them. And this was sort of different from the other platforms in that it was really just specific to infectious disease. It didn't have there are other questions on those other platforms that are more general. And so we started that up about a year and a half ago with funding from Open Philanthropy. And that was a year-long project. And we were just about to close down in December, but we got additional funding from Founders Pledge. And that let us, keep on operating. So we actually, one of the goals at the beginning was to sort of establish this platform, and we would have the platform set up and we would have forecasters ready to go in case there was a sort of pandemic. And here we were. We had it set up.
Lucky you got that.
Ready to go.
It's lucky you got that in December. COVID was already spreading.
Yeah, exactly. So, we were able to field about a dozen or so more questions about COVID-19. It was actually really interesting because there was a lot of uncertainty. The forecasters didn't really have sort of a clear answer on some things like what's the case fatality rate going to be. But then in other cases, they were very certain. And it sort of shows how hard it is to write these questions because we would put these ranges of cases and, immediately, forecasters would go to the highest range and, then, cases were just, exploding. And it was hard to tell, are cases exploding or is our testing capacity exploding? And so it was sort of, it did give us some new answers there that, this wasn't just going to sort of increase at a sort of moderate rate that we would sort of, be able to go along with over time. It was going to be explosive.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So just to back up, so you set up this kind of platform where contributors could make forecasts about disease outbreaks and it had been running for about a year. How many contributors did you have, and did they have a lot of experience in the area?
We had various numbers of contributors over time, but we were over 1,000 for people who signed up. Each question probably got between 60 and 150 forecasters working on it. And so they had varying degrees of expertise, but a lot of them were in the infectious disease world. We sent out some advertisements through ProMed Mail, and so got a lot of attention and interest from around the world. And so that was really something that we wanted to have this varying experience, right? We didn't want everyone to come from the same viewpoint because we thought that we would have stronger forecasts if we had, all these different sort of perspectives. And so, yeah, that's how we started out. We had a lot of different questions. We started out with other things like Ebola and cholera in Yemen, but, at the end, it was really all COVID.
Yeah. And this wasn't a money one or anything like that. I guess, were people doing it for bragging rights or just to be helpful?
Yeah, so no, there were prizes. We're pretty sensitive to how it looks to have people trading on death, basically. And I don't want anyone to ever, have that issue. And so there were prizes for people who were the most accurate, but we weren't doing like the commodities trading, and we just had a prize for 1 through 5. And then we had a random draw based on how many points you had for the next 20. And so people, were incentivized to do well, but I was hoping to avoid sort of that unsavory look of having people trade on these bad outcomes.
Yeah. As an economist, my reaction is like, what, you don't think life is precious enough to be worth trading in prediction markets? But I think that may not be the typical response that people have to people making money forecasting awful stuff. Okay, yeah. So how did they perform?
Well, for the most part, they performed really well. But the thing that we learned is that it's not like magic, right? People need to have information to make good forecasts. And if they don't, or if the sort of surveillance information is bad or really biased, then they don't make good forecasts. And so, I think it's great to have these sort of newfangled ways of getting opinion and thinking about the future. But if you don't do that sort of traditional epidemiological surveillance, you have a hard time. And so I think that, it just says that we need to do surveillance pretty well.
I guess, it has the shit in, shit out problem. That just if there's no actual base information collection that they can rely on, then their forecast can't be that good.
Exactly.
It's interesting.
That's exactly.
I was following the Metaculus predictions, which were running from fairly early on. And I kept noticing they just always seem to be trending in one direction. It's I guess like good forecasts should kind of go up and down roughly equally, or it should be hard to predict where they're going. But it seemed to just constantly be moving upwards, which made me wonder if there was something kind of broken about the algorithm, that it was constantly trailing. It was like maybe using old forecasts, or it could just be that people are very, maybe it was just a surprisingly large outcome. So we just kept learning more and more bad things. But did you find anything that there was like, it wasn't, what's the term for this? It should be a martingale, which I guess means that it's like you can't predict whether it's going to go up or down. Did you find that in your markets?
Right. Yeah. So actually, some of those questions we actually cross-posted between us and Metaculus, and they were great, and setting something up so we could compare at a later date. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to write these questions because you have to sort of think, okay, what could the range of outcomes be? And sort of the outbreak was moving so quickly, and we were finding, a lot of more bad things happening. And so, I think that it comes down to the fact that one limitation of these platforms is being able to write a good question, that the question requires a really good forecast just from the person who writes it. And so, if it's very, very difficult to do that. And also, the other thing is that when you actually score it at the end, you need to have a clear outcome, right? Because otherwise your forecasters are really upset that you maybe seemed like you were making an arbitrary choice, or they're like, well, I am going to argue it's actually this answer. And so you need sort of a clear piece of information about, what the actual resolution is. And that depends on surveillance and the timing of the surveillance. And if you say like, how many cases will be by X date, but the situation reports comes out 3 days later, when you fall in the crack between your two outcomes, then what do you do? So, I mean, it's really hard to write the questions.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's something Philip Tetlocker said when I interviewed him, that he thinks he'd almost like to spend less time thinking about good forecasting and more time thinking about good question asking.
Right.
Did you learn anything specific about how you can do this better, or is it just kind of a perpetual challenge that maybe the thing you really want to know, you haven't got an objective outcome for, and you have to keep changing the question because the world keeps changing, and so the thing you want to know is like every week is different?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I think the question writing is the hardest part. The forecasting, I think, is pretty straightforward. But yeah, writing the question in a way that's not ambiguous, if you say, how many counties will see cases of measles in this month? Well, did the person with measles drive through that county? Does that count? Was the person diagnosed in one county and then went back home to another county? How are we counting that? And so, it's just, we got better at it as we went along because we avoided some of these pitfalls that we experienced early in the project, but it was still, incredibly difficult even till the end.
Yeah, it's interesting. So when people I know have made bets against one another are predicting things that will happen, very often they've decided that there's no objective way of deciding who will have won. So they just appoint someone who they both like to just decide who was like closer to the truth. Because I haven't seen that many of those bets resolved. So maybe they'll just end up bickering endlessly about whether the arbiter was fair.
Are we talking about a slap bet commissioner?
What's that?
A slap bet commissioner. It was from like How I Met Your Mother, and they had a bet that the person who won got to slap the other, and so that they appointed a third party to determine the rules of how it would occur.
Okay, I guess it is kind of like that. I guess Brian Kaplan is an economist who's made a lot of public bets with people predicting things, and actually I'm the arbiter for one of them. which I think it's not going to come due for another 5 years or something. So I think we may well actually he keeps a spreadsheet. Otherwise, there's no chance I'd remember that. But yeah, one thing I wonder is maybe these prediction platforms need to like have someone who everyone kind of respects, who consistently decides who has won and builds up a track record of having decided in some reasonably fair way what the correct outcome was. And maybe even if people don't agree with every decision, they think the person overall is kind of reasonable, and so it's worth participating in it. Is that something you've considered doing, having a person who has their reputation on the line of deciding correctly who was right?
Yeah, I don't know who I'd get to volunteer for that, but I mean, that seems like a good solution. They would probably have to be pretty impervious to, the complaints that would come along with the job.
Do you enjoy hundreds of people shouting at you on the internet? Then have we got the job for you?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit like being a judge. Yeah, so what's the next step with this prediction platform? Are you satisfied that it's kind of useful and worth keeping around?
Well, so for right now, we're going into an analysis phase, so we don't have any more open questions. We've sort of shuttled our forecasters off to Metaculus and, forecasting on that platform. I think right now we sort of need to determine, what actually was working, which questions were sort of the best and provided the best outcomes. And also we're looking into sort of the characteristics of the forecasters. One thing I'd like to do, which I haven't had enough time to actually get going, is to set up a interview project where we can interview people, the people who did the best in the various different projects or various different rounds for the project, and see sort of how they were making their decisions. I mean, I know that the Good Judgment Project did this, and, I think it would be interesting to see if there were any differences when it came to infectious disease forecasting.
Yeah. My feeling is that we could do a lot better on disease forecasting, or at least like public opinion formation about where diseases are likely to go than we've done, and that would be really helpful. So you were saying earlier that, and I agree with this, that it seems like in late January or early February, we totally could have predicted more that what happened. Not with any certainty, but we could have said what has happened is completely plausible. There's a very mainline thing. It wasn't like this came out of left field, because I think the early stuff was like, well, the case fatality rate seems to be maybe around 1% once you adjust for some cases that we're not picking up. And it seems pretty contagious. Seems like it's spreading pretty fast. We haven't really contained something that seems as contagious as this, certainly not very often. So I guess it'll spread around the world and kill somewhere around 1% of people who get it. In a sense, like nothing surprising has happened. And yet it took a month longer really than we should have to start accepting that and reacting to it. And so it seems like having a prediction platform that very clearly sounds the alarm saying, yes, this may well happen, could help to get people to do something sooner next time.
Yes, I do think so. So for this platform, one of the things we were trying to do is just sort of test how accurate it was, right? Because we can't have people making decisions off of, bad models or bad forecasts. So that was one thing we're doing. We found that for a number of different types of questions, it did very well. I would always say, though, that, these forecasting platforms, new technologies, or even, traditional disease modeling should really be a decision support tool, but shouldn't sort of determine what your decision should be, and that there are a lot of other things that go into that. And I don't like the idea of putting all your sort of, I guess I'll say, eggs in one basket, right? I think that, you always have to think about the information that's going into these technologies, models, whatever, and then think about, how is that going to really bias the result. So all these things, I think, you should have a lot of different inputs into your decision making. And I wouldn't recommend, making a decision based off a forecasting platform or just one model or whatever. I think that, we need to really think about the details and the ins and outs of all those things before we decide.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting is, maybe I should ask an economist about this more than a public health person, but the stock market is kind of a big prediction market about how the pandemic is going to go. And the stock market seemed to get things really wrong as well. Like throughout February, it was pretty complacent about it, even though there was like billions of dollars on the line there. So it suggests that people getting it wrong was pretty widespread. It wasn't just a handful of politicians.
Yeah, I think the stock market, I don't think that there was a lot of understanding of what was actually happening with that disease. I don't know why, because you're right. There's a lot of money on the line. And it just seems like there wasn't a lot of thought. I think, early on, my friend who was going on a Moody's webinar, and, they were saying that they were just going to have their forecast be that there would be 1 million cases. And that was like, we were at like 500,000 at the time. And it was like, this doesn't make any sense at all. And so, I think there was some sort of like, we don't want to be too pessimistic in the approach, which I think that was wrong.
Not so smart. Yeah. I guess maybe I've seen this happen a couple of times where the stock market just seems kind of blind to like real world events that require domain expertise to properly understand things that like stand outside the financial system. It's not about predicting the Federal Reserve or something like that. It's about predicting a disease, which is like not really what financial analysts know the most about. And in those cases, it seems to do fairly poorly, I think, because there'll be like 1% of people who are trading in financial markets who know enough about this and it really draws their attention and they start thinking about it. But that 1% isn't really enough to move the market as a whole. And so they end up making a whole bunch of money on that occasion from other people who aren't really paying attention or who don't understand what's going on. But I mean, I think my inclination as an economist is kind of to trust the financial markets and be like, oh, the stock market really is a useful indication. But I think sometimes on questions that are outside the expertise of stock traders, it really doesn't tell you nearly as much as you would expect.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm no financial expert, but I think that that's exactly right.
Yeah. What else is CHS trying to do to address the pandemic? You got the prediction market thing, you're writing a whole lot of reports. Is there other things going on that it's worth people knowing about?
Oh man, there are so many things going on. There are reports coming out almost every day on different things, trying to help policymakers make decisions about the future, plan a, sustainable and thoughtful way back, probably not to normality, but to something that's more sustainable. So there's a ton of work going on. I think we're also, when we have a moment to breathe, we'll be trying to do more on, this is a policy window in which we need to sort of think, okay, what really should we be doing to get ready for next time? Because there will be a next time. This is not like a one-time event, right? This is actually, in many ways, this is less than the pandemic that I imagined we were preparing for. And so we have shown that even at this level, we're not ready. And so it shows us there's a lot of work to be done. And so I think that that's the next stage, but right now I think us and everyone else sort of just kind of reacting to what's happening with right now and how to, think about the more immediate future. But, soon we will be thinking about, the next pandemic or the next bioterrorism event that, we need to start getting ready for.
Yeah. Do you worry that it might be important to focus on kind of the next pandemic or preparing for the bigger picture now while people are really excited? Because you can imagine maybe we'll come up with a solution for this specific virus at some point in the next year or two, and then people will just like not be that interested in spending billions of dollars to actually prepare us for, more generic antivirals and more generic vaccine platforms that will be able to deal with the next thing rather than just the disaster that we have going on right now.
Right. That's a fair criticism of the way that the United States has responded to biological events in the past. It's a cycle of panic and neglect, right? You panic and you respond and try to prepare yourself for the last pandemic or the last disease. And you don't actually, think about what the next one could be or the most likely one could be or the worst case scenario. And so, I do think that there needs to be a change in thinking. If that, will this disease change that thinking? I don't know. I hope it does, but the past hasn't been an indicator that we learn from these mistakes.
Yeah. It's not only the US. I mean, I think Australia and the UK both only had influenza pandemic plans, which meant that they made a bunch of mistakes because all of their planning was based around influenza as a virus and not around what would SARS 2.0 be like.
Oh, right. And the thing is that flu is probably the most tractable of the diseases because we actually have a vaccine and a large scale manufacturing sort of industry that's ready to go. When it comes to like, if you have a vaccine that's ready to go and it's not flu vaccine, an ability to manufacture that vaccine at a scale that actually helps, protect the world seems fairly impossible right now. And so flu seems to be the thing that we're most likely to be able to handle.
Yeah. I wonder whether some people, it's perverse, but I wonder whether like now is a moment that some people who are currently focusing on COVID-19 should be putting together spending proposals for stuff that will help with the next pandemic before like we solve this and before people start to lose interest. So maybe this is time to be saying we should be spending billions on like generic virus production platforms and getting just like tons of stuff through the budget ASAP.
Right. Right. I mean, I've been thinking about that with Michael Montague, but it's just this response is so overwhelming. I'd like to have those things ready to go when people have a chance to breathe, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, it seems like a slightly crazy moment to be thinking about a pandemic 10 years from now. But yeah, a listener wrote in with a question about how receptive people in the US government have been to a proposal in a CHS report to spend about $3.5 billion hiring 100,000 contact tracers, which seems like it would be a bargain potentially, because then you could actually get the rest of the economy going. I mean, it sounds like a lot of money. And maybe the questioner was thinking, maybe they're going to say, oh, this is too expensive. But of course, it could save $1 trillion. I'm curious to know, have people realize the logic there?
Yeah, well, $3.5 billion seems like budget dust at this point, right?
Exactly.
So there has been, some uptake and a lot of and interest in that proposal. Crystal Watson led that report. And I think there has been a lot of interest. And I think also, if we're not able to move technology forward in a way that, gets us a vaccine, gets us a countermeasure, gets us, whatever things that we need, the serology, the testing at how many ever million tests we need per week. If we can't get to that level, I think contact tracing may be one of the most tractable things that can be done. That, if we're spending a lot of money or we're losing a lot of money, it makes sense to spend money on contact tracers. We have plenty of people who are out of work who can do this, and that, tracking down who might be exposed and who needs to stay inside for a couple of weeks, I think may be the key to making it so that we can all sort of get out of our houses.
Yeah. I guess if you think about it, even if 1% of the entire workforce is just doing contact tracing, that's like a lot more efficient than having people not be able to work at all.
Right.
I guess that maybe the challenge there is, well, people could be irrational and not want to spend the money, but the challenge might be, how do you scale up enough people, train them to do something that might be a little bit tricky and a little bit fiddly, and give them all of the equipment, like given that we're trying to do this within months?
Yeah, I mean, people are going to have to be trained. They're going to have to be smart. They're going to have to, be thoughtful about the way that they go about this. You can't just have someone randomly sort of try to do it. And so that is the trick, to get people trained up. But I think, that's not as hard as all these other things that we've been sort of thinking about it. And it's not as hard as having everyone be out of work. Let's just do it.
One thing you wrote in the notes here is it's important to consider COVID-19 from a big picture perspective, and deaths are not the only health impact of importance. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So one thing that I've been worried about in this response, and, it seems like when we think about models of COVID deaths and we think about what we're doing to stay inside to prevent COVID deaths, from a public health perspective, COVID deaths aren't the only deaths that occur in the U.S. They're not the only public health problem that we're going to have. And so I think, I'm worried also, not only about having, I'm worried about COVID deaths, but I'm also worried about, all these cancer surgeries that aren't happening because we don't have elective surgeries, that, that biopsy that didn't happen, someone who should have gone to the hospital for a stroke, but wasn't, didn't feel like they should, all these things, growing obesity, I do think that, these problems that are coming out of, the measures that we are taking to prevent the spread of the transmission of COVID, I worry about them. Plenty of people die from being poor. I worry about suicides. I think that these things, we need to think of this from a big picture perspective and not just do everything we can just to prevent COVID deaths.
Yeah. I've heard from smart people, I guess some economists, where are they from? So it's smart amateurs who kind of think about this intuitively and like, well, this number of people will die from COVID-19, but won't like even more people potentially die from the response, as you're saying, from like people not doing exercise, from people losing their jobs and becoming depressed or just being poorer in the long term because the economy is being so messed with. Has CHS tried to run any numbers on, like, is it possible that we're going to worsen people's health overall if we have to keep running these lockdowns for a very long time?
We haven't run anything like that. I think that this is sort of an idea that's sort of percolating through the public health community now. And so, COVID was a big threat, and certainly many people are dying every day from COVID. So I don't want to minimize that. But I do think, I just want to say, hey, we got to think big picture here. And we also have to think about, more than just COVID when it comes to public health in the US or in the world.
Completely, yeah. Initially, I was very supportive of the stay-at-home orders, and I think that they probably were the right call at the time. But then maybe it does come a point where a country, if they look at how their preparations are going for the time after that, and just generally their state capacity, and they think, realistically, we're not going to have the testing capacity or the tracing capacity soon enough, or we're just not going to be able to do the follow-through to control the disease after the lockdown period, that you might have to accept that you are going to end up with the herd immunity strategy, because the alternative is to lock down the country for 12 months, 18 months. It's just like so impractical. And the damage of doing that is just gets too high. Where there'll be other countries where they do have the capacity to keep the disease under control without a lockdown, and they can pursue that alternative approach. But it does just, I guess, if I was thinking about herd immunity strategy and the immense damage that would do versus stay-at-home orders on and off for 12 or 18 months, it becomes pretty questionable whether that's worth it in my mind.
I think that this is a debate that's worth having in the public health and larger community. I don't feel qualified to make that call on what's worth it versus not. But I do think, though, that, there might be a middle ground between lockdown and full on, national chickenpox party, right? I think that people, if we can encourage people to understand how to reduce their risks, that may be, incredibly helpful in having people reduce their mixing, reduce their contacts to a point that we might be able to have the economy running at, some, percent of normal and be able to control the disease. I don't really know, how possible that is. I think we're going to have to do a little bit of experimentation to see, maybe go back and forth. I think also asking people to stay home is different than, a lockdown, which is very coercive. In Maryland, we had sort of these requests to stay at home. We were working from home. We weren't mixing. We were not having big groups. And then there was the lockdown order or the shelter in place order or whatever. And to me, it didn't really make a measurable difference other than I felt really trapped in my house. And I think that psychological difference is actually really important.
Yeah, you've mentioned that a few times, that you think it's one thing for people to stay at home voluntarily versus being told to or being forced to. Is that because people object to it more, or it just makes them feel worse? Or is it that a kind of the coercive part of it is like a moral kind of in itself, forcing people to do things against their will? Or maybe that it saps public confidence in the government over time versus something that they're choosing to do because they just think it's good?
I think it comes from my faith in people, and that I think that people are reasonable, and that, they if you give them enough information about risks, they can make thoughtful choices that, that still correspond to, the needs in their lives. And so some people may take more risk because they have to. But I will admit that that's kind of a rosy picture of what, of other people, and other people may not have that faith. And so I might be wrong. And I think, that's certainly possible that a lockdown order is necessary. Otherwise, people make bad choices. But I would like to have more faith in people than that, because otherwise, that's sort of, the lockdown orders aren't going to be something we can do for 18 months, and we're not going to have a vaccine, and we're not going to have the testing that we need. So at the end of the day, we are going to have to trust people to do the right thing. So, we got to communicate and make it so that can happen.
Has the response kind of affected your views on what policies are necessary or should be prioritized for next time?
The response has the fact that stay-at-home orders are actually possible in the U.S. and seem to work. It's certainly, I had not really had a lot of faith in that before, and I feel like I've been surprised. But, I don't want stay-at-home orders to be the way we deal with pandemics in the future, right? Like, great, it worked, but I don't want to do this again. And so, I think that it has shown us that we need to probably prioritize some other responses, vaccine development, countermeasure development, increasing the capacity of our healthcare system. Right now, because in the US, the healthcare system is, sort of either a profit or nonprofit, but, very slim margin kind of operation. It's hard to have that extra capacity that's really necessary for, something like this. And so that's really critical. Also, PPE. I know that people were storing this stuff up. How do we run out?
It's crazy. It's crazy.
And the swabs, that we've run out of swabs to do the tests in many places. It's shocking to me. And so, I guess maybe other people wouldn't be shocked by that, and people who really look at it more in depth. But how come we didn't think that we should have the capacity for that? I think that that's one thing, that at least one lesson coming out of this, that we should have these stockpiles, and that it's really valuable to have them, and that, coming out of this, if you end up with an extra amount of PPE, maybe you should save it and not try to, spend it down.
Yeah, I think the cost of stockpiling PPE is not that high. If you rotate it through and you just end up having a bunch sitting there in storage warehouses so that it doesn't break down, it seems like it would be a bargain.
Right.
Well, okay, an idea that I've heard is that we need to legalize, and I do actually think this myself, that we need to legalize price gouging during emergencies, because then people I don't know that I trust the government to actually stockpile enough PPE for next time. And we need people in the private sector to potentially stockpile this stuff and then sell it at 10 or 100 times the normal price during disasters, so that someone else will do it if our leaders don't have the foresight to do it themselves.
There certainly needs to be incentives. I'm not going to go there. But I will say, that Taiwan has a system where they have a stockpile, and then they move things out of the stockpile into, use, and then put new things back in the stockpile. So it's always, it doesn't expire. It's ready to go. You just have it, on hand. And I think that that's a really reasonable way to go about things.
Yeah. Fingers crossed, I think we'll see wearing of surgical masks just by the general public be super normalized, which will hopefully then lead to a big increase in our total ability to manufacture PPE, so that during a disaster, we'll be able to, we'll just naturally be producing several times as much as we were before, and then we can prioritize healthcare workers during those times. So maybe people have like stored up a little bit in their own houses. So there'll be like some natural response, even if the government doesn't get smarter about it. But
I mean, yeah, I think at this point, masks, getting, cloth masks right now, and then when we have enough for everyone else, it seems like having masks is valuable for source control. I still don't think that having masks protects you that much, but it could, potentially do something in reducing, spread from people who are sick. Although I think if you're sick, you should just stay home. Yeah. And, if you're at super high risk, you should also just stay home. Don't wear a mask to try to,
pretend that's going to
think that you're
save you.
Yeah, pretend that's going to help you. Yeah.
How do you think the bio-risk community is going to be different, if at all, after this? Do you think that people will kind of take it more seriously on a persistent basis?
I mean, well, so the bio-risk community was taking it seriously.
No, I was thinking, will other people take the bio-risk community seriously?
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, I hope so. It's strange to have people who don't do this as, like for the past 10 years, really interested in this work. And so I hope that does continue to be interest and also political interest in moving these issues forward. I do worry that it sort of becomes just sort of commonplace and that people don't, are just feel all too familiar with it. But I think, there are opportunities here for the bio-risk community to have a greater say in things. And, I think also this is sort of brought up, and this is a little bit different question than you've asked, but, evidence that, this type of disease or something similar causes this much disruption certainly should make people aware that there's a risk for people getting ideas from this and trying to do bad things.
Yeah. You mentioned face masks. Is there anything that people in the general public should not do if they want to protect themselves or help with the crisis? Are there any mistakes that people are making?
Sometimes wearing a face mask can make you touch your eyes or your nose or, dig under your face mask more. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what touching like your cheek really makes a difference for. I'm not absorbing the virus through my cheek. But, I think, when the air is coming up out of your mask into your eyes, like, makes your eyes itch. So, we shouldn't, be touching our eyes, even though we're wearing a mask. And I do worry, like I said before, that people will feel kind of like they can do riskier things wearing a mask. I had, people are like, well, I'll wear a mask when I go see my grandkids. And, I'm an older person. Well, seems like a bad idea. Maybe you just shouldn't go see your grandkids and wait, for a little while until we have a better handle on, making sure that you're safe.
Yeah, on balance, I probably am in favor of face masks. But this risk compensation thing does seem like it could eat away a lot of the benefits. If people decide, oh, now I'm going to go out a whole bunch more because the mask it makes me feel a lot safer to be wearing a mask.
Right. This is a role for risk communication. I don't want to say that people automatically do this risk compensation, but I think this is a role for communicating with people so they understand actually what they're doing and why they're wearing a mask. They're wearing a mask to protect other people. I think that's a critical component there, to just have people understand what's going on.
Yeah. Are there any other lessons that we can learn from COVID-19 that might help us with future pandemics?
There's so many. It's hard to really parse them out. I mean, it's clear that we have a lot of work to do. It's clear that, we need to be able to come to some consensus on some of these measures we're using to protect ourselves and others, that the debate that was happening in public over masks probably didn't help. And, I was part of that debate early on. I really didn't think that they were that helpful because, I was thinking of them as a way to protect yourself. But then when we think about asymptomatic transmission and the fact, that someone might be out and about and have the disease and not know it and still be able to spread it, that, changed things. Probably my own messaging on that could have been improved by saying we might learn more and it might be different. Yeah. But, so I should take my own advice there.
That seems like it was a little bit of a fiasco. I guess maybe the community the public health community was a little bit too confident about they wanted to give a simple message and they thought that was the right message, but then it meant that there wasn't a lot of flexibility about changing it later on. If evidence came in, that was different.
Yeah. The other lessons, I think that, I've already talked about them a little bit, but that, testing and understanding what's going on with the epi curve are really critical. Like taking these guesses based and having that, the information that's coming in be so biased by your testing protocols, and also having those testing protocols be different everywhere. So you can't even compare, different sets of data to each other. Just really problematic. It's clear we need to have serology testing much earlier. And so, I think that, this is something that really needs some work.
Yeah. One thing I've learned is I suppose maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic about our ability to respond to a very deadly new pathogen. Like if it was killing 10% of people, then it seems like we really would potentially just do a full lockdown very early, which would buy us some time, which I hadn't really realized that would be willing to go quite as far as we have gone in some ways. On the other hand, it seems like any new outbreak, that even one that's not that deadly, just imposes this enormous economic disruption, more than I would have guessed. I would have thought, oh, well, something that kills 0.5% of people who get it, probably it's not going to cost tens of trillions of dollars to deal with that. But it has, I guess, because we're choosing to do this big response, which might help, but it means that it's like the financial cost is enormous. I guess it seems like it might change the cost-benefit analysis for preparing for this kind of thing going forward, because it's so easy to quantify financially and in terms of tax revenue, the cost of not being prepared.
Right. If the cost of not being prepared is trillions of dollars to our economy, maybe we should spend that money on being prepared.
Yeah, maybe we should put some masks in a cave. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully that will get through to politicians in the future more. What's another example? I suppose that the UK had some of the best modeling for dealing with pandemics that was out there. But I guess it hadn't been funded enough, or they hadn't thought ahead enough to make it very flexible and have it be checked and kind of open source, so that you could very quickly get lots of people trying to produce different models of the new disease and cross-checking it and things like that. In a sense, the UK deserves credit because it had sufficiently good disease modeling that other countries were looking to it for advice. But even there, we hadn't prepared ahead to think, wow, we're going to need these results really quickly, within weeks, and it could be something that's quite unexpected. I really hope that kind of stuff gets more funding.
So yeah, it's clear that having good models early on is really critical. And, I will say that, it's also really important to have, we talked about this already, to have good information to go into those models, right? And understanding, what biases might be happening because of the different ways that you're testing. So I think that's important. Now, it's clear that policymakers are looking to modelers to help them make decisions. And so, that's not going to change. But, having good models up front is really important, as long as we understand that they're just models and that we're going to, they're going to help us make decisions, but they're not, I would not say that they're a perfect prediction of the future, and would always caution against that.
Yeah. Something that occurred to me a couple of weeks later, maybe than it should have, is that in a situation like this where you're trying to respond very quickly on the fly to something that's a bit unpredictable and very uncertain, relying on kind of sophisticated models can potentially lead you astray relative to following heuristics like, let's just do what other people have done, or let's do what's worked in the past, or let's do the thing that preserves option value. I guess this is a thing that I think you find in decision-making literature, that the more complex and uncertain and volatile a situation, the less you want to rely on any kind of very specific, sophisticated model to guide your decision-making. Do you think there's something to that?
Yeah. Decision-making, science isn't my specialty. Crystal Watson at our center is the person who really does a lot of that. But I do think there are other ways to make decisions, and I think that we should sort of try to get all the information together. I guess, one thing that really has happened in this outbreak is that China experienced the outbreak first. And so for the most part, everyone has tried to copy China. And I was worried that we wouldn't be able to do it because we don't have the same testing capacity, the same ability to contact trace and sort of enforce people staying inside. Now, certainly we've seen a lot of people stay inside, but, China was able to move on to, the next phase. And so I think when you put these things in place, you need to be able to think ahead to say, and then what? And, okay, so we did lockdowns. Now, what are we going to do? How do we get out of it? And so I think that that's sort of a critical piece of sort of making decisions about an outbreak response, is that, you're responding to the threat of the day, but you also think ahead about, what are our next steps? And so we need to be able to have those things that help us take those next steps, which we don't yet.
Yeah. All right, let's push on from COVID-19 specifically and talk about our report that you contributed to from back in 2018, which was called 15 Emerging Technologies with Potential to Reduce Global Catastrophic Biological Risks. What are some of the technologies in there that you thought were particularly exciting? Or maybe, would you like to describe what the main message of that report was first, perhaps?
Yeah, so this report was, a way of thinking about GCBRs, or global catastrophic biological risks, in a more positive way, right? So when you think about these risks, a lot of times the writing and the thinking is very dark, right? It's like so many millions of people could die, and, it's going to be the end of the world, and here's the disease that's going to kill you, blah, 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 blah. And so, here we were trying to say, okay, what's the other side? What's the positive side of this? How could we actually meet this threat in ways with technologies that are really going to change the game? And so we came up with 15 different technologies, and they came in a different phases of an outbreak, from disease detection to diagnostics, and then how we're manufacturing countermeasures, distributing them, and then, how we're actually caring for people. And so we had a range of different technologies in these different areas. And, some are probably closer to reality than others. The ones that I think I'm most excited about, in the context of this experience with this pandemic, is really the easy to use ventilators and microfluidic devices, because they can sort of solve our problems, or at least help solve those problems, with the rapid and expansive testing. And then also, that hospital capacity. If hospital capacity is the thing that we're really worried about not having enough of, then one of those steps is having enough ventilators and having them be something that you don't have to have specialized training to actually operate.
Right. Yeah. I was going to say, I was surprised you said ventilators, because it seems like a lot of people think that the bottleneck's going to be people to operate them, where it seems like you need really experienced nurses and medical professionals to do that. But I guess, so you think it's possible to produce ventilators that an amateur might be able to operate to a sufficiently good degree?
Well, that's the vision. I mean, I don't think that we're there yet. You do need to know how to operate the ones that we have right now. So it's not just producing more ventilators like we have, but producing ventilators that, a range of people can operate. Because, the bottleneck is the staff, there is a number of staff members, like you said.
Yeah. I've heard some people claiming that by the time people get onto ventilators, most people die, even if they get ventilation. And so maybe ventilators aren't as helpful as we think, and we should be trying other treatment options. Yeah. Have you looked into that one at all?
So people mentioned it actually in our call this morning, that in some hospital systems, it seems like a large number of people on ventilators end up dying, but that isn't reflective of, what's happening all across the country. And so in other places, it seems like they're able to get people off the ventilators. But, having the capacity, the ICU capacity to take care of these people, and ventilators are part of that story, that's why we're doing this social distancing, right? We're doing it so that we don't overwhelm hospital capacity. And so if, we're trying to manage one side of the equation, perhaps we should try to change the other side of the equation.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned microfluidic devices. What are they, and why might they make a really big difference?
One type of microfluidic device would be paper-based testing. That it's just a way to do rapid tests that don't have to go to a lab, and that you can sort of get the results pretty quickly. And so I think this could really change the game, right? Because right now, if it takes a couple of days to get your test, and then it takes a couple of days to get your test back, and by the time you get that and you start doing contact tracing, you're already in big trouble. It's hard to really make a change, in the epi curve that way. But if you can say, I'm starting to feel sick, and then you take a test and immediately, you can tell everyone you've been in contact in the last, couple of days that, hey, you should watch for symptoms or take your own test. I think that's a game changer.
Yeah. Is that one for COVID-19 specifically, or is it something that you think could make a really big difference just with all future pandemics, if we can make that standard?
I think all future pandemics. I think we've seen that the diagnostics and the understanding of what's going on with the disease, reducing that uncertainty, is really critical for making good decisions. And so much of that comes from having good and rapid tests.
What's stopping us from having these tests now, the microfluidic tests that don't need to go to a lab?
This is getting actually outside of my area of expertise. So I'd refer you to the serology report that just came out from the center.
We'll stick up a link to that.
I think that's probably a good place for people to go look and see some sort of good testing that's coming out. I don't really know exactly what the problem is, but I don't think that we're there yet.
Yeah, are there any technologies from that 15 emerging technologies to reduce GCBR report that you're interested in, or I think it would be fun to describe to the audience? One that I was particularly interested in was the idea of vaccines that spread virally. So you could produce... You're saying that, has that one also drawn interest from others?
Yeah, so the self-spreading vaccines, ethically fraught, but really interesting, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. I could just imagine the reaction from some people on Twitter. It seems like, how are you going to get that one past the Institutional Review Board?
Right. You certainly can't consent someone who's getting a vaccine this way. So I think that the original idea was that it would be, you could vaccinate animal populations this way pretty easily if you had an animal disease. I'm not gonna say that I don't know how to get over those ethical hurdles as far as doing it in people. It might be a break glass kind of thing in case of emergency. But that was just an idea that we thought was really interesting, that you can give a vaccine to one person, and that it's you don't have to deal so much with the distribution problem. But like I said, huge ethical problems there. So, and I don't know how you get that through the regulatory process either, but valuable enough of an idea just to at least bring up.
Completely, yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating one. I suppose the idea is, well, what if you could take the COVID-19 virus and then change it such that it doesn't actually do people any health damage, or like very rarely does, and then get that one out there? Then that's going to spread around and just inoculate people against it. And is it that much worse? In the alternative world, they're going to get this other disease probably. So I suppose, yeah, it is ethically fraught, but there's also kind of a common sense way in which doesn't this make a whole lot of sense?
Yeah, so that's why it's there, but obviously with the caveat of
you don't think we're going to roll that
problems.
out? Yeah. We're not going to roll that one out next year. Yeah, are there any other ones that are exciting and worth explaining?
One thing that I was working on for this report was the robotics and telehealth. And so, I do think if you're worried about a disease that's like really taking down your frontline practitioners, if you have the ability to sort of see people through telehealth and we were already actually even doing this, but, if you have people also in hospitals and some of that treatment can happen through robotics, I think that you can reduce exposure to healthcare personnel that you really need to have on the front lines. And so, that might be something that could really help in a pandemic. I mean, all of these are something that could really help in a pandemic, but that was something that really, struck me as you could even do home-based care in that case.
And the barriers to that one might not be so serious.
Right.
Yeah, interesting. I guess it seems maybe I've moved towards thinking that diagnostics is especially important, that if we had a generic platform that could diagnose people, like kind of the nanopore sequencing stuff, DNA sequencing has become so much cheaper so quickly that you could imagine that we could end up with DNA sequences that are distributed just all over the place, at least in developed countries, that can very quickly figure out whether someone has the telltale DNA or RNA for a particular virus, and could massively scale up our ability to diagnose people with new conditions. And then we just won't find ourselves in this horrible situation that we've been in, where it takes months to be able to get to a level where we can diagnose even 10% of the people who have this illness. And that could potentially make a huge difference to early control.
Oh, yeah, huge difference. And I think, it also tells you a lot more about the severity of the disease. We think this is very severe, but we don't really have a clear idea on the denominator of, our cases and deaths, right? So, if we had better diagnostics and we were able to roll them out to everyone who we wanted to test, we could make decisions with a lot more certainty and a lot more sort of faith that was the right thing to do.
Yeah, and when you don't have such a bottleneck on the access to tests, then it's going to be a lot easier to very early get up these surveillance ones, or these like randomly sampled ones, where you just say, well, let's just test a random 1,000 people coming in. And then you can kind of figure out, what is actually the infection fatality rate here much earlier? And is it worth shutting down the economy to stop this? Whereas kind of we had to do that a little bit blind.
Right. I mean, I think it was using a public health precautionary principle that we don't know how bad it's going to be. We need to do this to sort of take stock. I wish that the time that we spent while we were been doing this, we could come out of the other end knowing, what actually is the case. I think we're still kind of in the dark, and now making, the next set of choices in the dark. So diagnostics would really help us figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah, another interesting idea in the report was, it seemed like the idea of vaccinating people basically using a Band-Aid, because currently there's kind of this bottleneck on vaccination campaigns, which is very often you need some kind of at least some level of medical training to inject people with a vaccine. Whereas what if you could just mail out every year someone the flu vaccine in a Band-Aid, and everyone gets it in the mail and they just sticks it on themselves and that's done. And it sounded like this isn't so far off being possible, and that could really increase our ability to vaccinate people very quickly in an emergency.
Right. I think that was one that seemed closer than others. And you're right. What if you could just send these vaccines to everyone? The distribution problem and the getting it actually into people would be solved. And so, you'd still have to come up with the vaccine and, do safety tests and manufacture it, whatever. But this solves a huge bottleneck when it comes to getting vaccines into people. And so that was one that is pretty exciting as well.
Yeah. One that struck me as a little bit odd was using drones to kind of collect samples from out in the environment. And I guess by environment, it didn't mean kind of city streets. I think it meant actually out in rural areas, or perhaps I misunderstood what the idea was.
Yeah, so actually, this is actually something that's kind of happening already. You're using drones to catch mosquitoes, and then you bring them, you test them for, different diseases. And so you could kind of do something like that, or you could, use other ways to sort of collect, information on what's happening out there and sort of pull those in. So you don't have to have someone drive out, take a sample, do whatever, catch a mosquito. And so that's kind of part of that idea.
Okay, yeah, that's okay. I kind of missed that it was catching mosquitoes. I suppose you can catch.
Well, I don't think. Yeah, it wouldn't always be catching mosquitoes. Maybe you would take water samples or whatever if you're worried about what's happening in the ocean, that kind of thing.
That makes sense. And I guess, yeah, other proposals included ways of constructing molecules, which I suppose is important for making vaccines and other treatments. So in order to be able to scale up treatments more quickly. One thing I've wondered is why can't we just get bacteria to make the antigens that match up the viruses that we want people to develop resistance against or develop an immune response to? Maybe this is I should talk to a biologist about this one.
Yeah, this isn't really my area of expertise. We just collect this information for the report, and that was something that we saw as possible. So you could actually maybe you could combine, synthetic biology and 3D printing, and you could actually have the bacteria create the precursors that you need for the drugs that then you could print basically. So, this is sort of out there stuff. But yeah, I think synthetic biology is actually something that could really be helpful here as well.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's kind of increasing the risk in some ways, but then there's all these opportunities for it to help as well. And we just got to make sure that we take those as well. Yeah, I wasn't surprised when you said that there is this concern that with global catastrophic biological risk, it's kind of all doom and gloom. And I've found that sometimes it's really hard, I think, to get people to click through to articles about that on our website because it just sounds so negative. Who wants to read about just another thing that can go wrong horribly? And I noticed with this report, it was all very bright. It was beautifully illustrated, very nicely designed. It was fun to read about. It's fun to read about these technologies in a way that it wouldn't be fun to read about millions of people dying necessarily.
Right.
So I guess this was by design to try to get people to be more positive and more hopeful about this issue?
Yeah, and to sort of have people, capture the imaginations of people who, want to think creatively about these issues, to invest in new things that are, interesting solutions that it might move us forward. It's not just, as a public health person, I certainly think capability on the ground is important, but, investing in these technologies really, could be a huge opportunity. So we want to think about opportunities as well as risks.
Yeah. Yeah, whoever illustrated it really deserves some credit.
They were great.
We'll stick up a link for people to have a read. I keep wanting to steal the little images from it for my own stuff. So according to your bio, you started at the Center for Health Security back in 2009. And I guess this GCBR, or the Global Catastrophic Biological Risk thing, seems to really have come into vogue the last couple of years. I suppose the ideas were around beforehand, but it's become a bigger deal, I think, in the health security space. How have you found that? Do you think that's going to be a big focus for you going forward or for CHS?
So, we do a lot of focus on global catastrophic biological risk. Part of that's, funding related. But, I think this outbreak actually has shown us that, there are steps before that we need to sort of be able to do in order to respond to a global catastrophic biological risk. So when I came into the field, there was a lot about bioterrorism that we were working on, and sort of things have sort of shifted. We opened the areas of things that we were working on to be more health security. So it's not just bio. I was doing some nuclear consequence management for a while. That's a big problem too, that people really don't feel like they can really take even the first step on. And so, it's been an interesting few years thinking about all these terrible things, I guess.
Is there any resistance from people who maybe think GCBR's, they're a serious issue, but they're not super likely, so we should keep focusing on the things that we were before GCBRs became more fashionable?
I think that there is that pushback, but I also think, as we try to get a handle on GCBRs, I think that helps us get a handle on these other outbreaks. And so I think that they're part of a spectrum of the same thing. And so, it's really important to think about both. And I wouldn't, discount one because of the other. In that report, you point out that very often there's kind of some commercial applications for these technologies that we could develop, but they tend to maybe lag behind where they could be because they'd be really useful to society, but there aren't that many commercial applications. Who's really going to put in the effort to get them up to a big scale? Are there any options for addressing that problem other than just getting more government science grants or grants for health security? Yeah. So I feel like this is actually one area where, I think the ingenuity and the can-do attitude of the EA community really could have a lot of value. Thinking about how we move these technologies forward, how we can grow interest in them in a way that, gets their everyday use sort of more valued. Because that's the key. If we can get things into everyday use, then they're easy to use in a pandemic. So I don't know. I guess I don't have the answers here, but I think that this is an area that I'd love to see some creative thinking, the type that the EA community really does so well. Yeah. I actually know a few people involved in the effective altruism community who have been looking at more commercial applications for diagnostics, trying to find some commercial path from something that we're almost being able to use. Can we find a way to make this profitable to scale up so that it is available during a pandemic? Yeah, I hope maybe I'll be able to get one of them on the show in future to talk about their plans for that. Perhaps they want to keep that under wraps for their business.
Do you know any particularly good resources about GCBRs that people should maybe go and read about that aren't super widely known?
Well, there's that original sort of definition paper for GCBRs that, we wrote as a center. And actually, it was really a great process in sort of coming to that definition. We had these big meetings together and sort of talked it through what we thought it really meant. And so, I think that's valuable. But I think some of the work that's been published on Open Philanthropy's web pages is really valuable. I looked at the stuff that you guys published, and I think it's great. So, I think that there's a lot of good stuff out there.
Fantastic. Yeah. I guess I haven't left a lot of time to talk about career advice in GCBRs because we've done some episodes on it before. We've talked to Tom Inglesby and we'll probably have some more in future. But is there anything you'd like to highlight to people who've kind of been inspired by COVID-19 to think about a career working on global catastrophic biological risks, like places to go and work, people to study with, or things that they should keep in mind?
Yeah, I think, one piece of advice is don't be afraid to get in on the ground floor. I retired from professional sports and came to the center as an analyst, and I counted paragraphs for references. Sometimes you just have to slog through it. Once you've gained that experience, you move up. And so I think that's one thing to think about. The other is to use your network to sort of make those connections. It's a small world. It's hard to get into sometimes. I was lucky. I'll say my boyfriend at the time, now husband, his roommate's dad knew Tom Inglesby. And so connected me when I retired from swimming. He's like, what are you going to do with your life? And I said, I don't know, but I think this exercise called Dark Winter is really cool. And he was like, well, I know who you should talk to.
Yeah.
And so the rest is kind of history. But, I came to work at the center, and then, I very quickly realized that I needed a terminal degree also. And so, I was working at the center part-time while I was getting my PhD as well. So there were a number of steps and ladders to climb to move through the biosecurity community.
Yeah, so it's a little bit chancy, your conversion from swimming to working on health security.
Yeah, that's what most of life is chance, right?
It's true, yeah. Are there lots of opportunities for people to move from kind of conventional biosecurity into working on global catastrophic biological risks at this point, do you think?
That's a tough question. I think global catastrophic biological risks there's something that many people are growing in their interest for. I think it really depends on where the funding is. It's hard to do work that's not funded. And so, we're always trying to build a grant proposal or a contract proposal, and that kind of leads the way.
Yeah. I guess at 80,000 hours, we've kind of been assuming that the number of jobs in biosecurity and pandemic control might multiply several fold in the next 5 or 10 years, just because people will have this memory of COVID-19, or I guess it will still be going on for a while. Do you think that's right? Is it possible that we'll kind of forget about it, or governments actually won't put forward the funding that currently they suggest that they might?
So I think that funding is required to grow jobs in this field. There's a limited number right now, and I think government is going to be where the jobs are going to expand. We do need more people working on this at the CDC. We need more capacity at the local public health. I think that GCBRs are, important and something that can be worked on at the local public health level, but I think that people really need to be able to be flexible and work on everything from, the local outbreak to a GCBR, and sort of have that flexibility of thinking and an approach to sort of grow the jobs out here. Because it's not that everyone's going to be working just on GCBRs. That would just flood the field. I think that would be tough. But I think it's clear that we need a lot more work sort of along that spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose in the past, I thought a lot of the work that would be focused on global catastrophic biological risks could be quite different than other pandemic control. And maybe there are some really important targeted things like regulation of gain of function research, where it's like, well, you probably wouldn't do that if you were just interested in pandemics in general. And maybe that is a very important issue for GCBR risk reduction. But I guess, do you think that for many people, it could just be like the way to reduce GCBRs is just to reduce transmission of diseases in general, or to be able to respond to pandemics in general? Because, well, anything that reduces transmission of disease means that it's easier to get R below 1 in a disaster scenario, in a GCBR scenario?
Well, I think that, like you said, there are definitely a number of things that are unique to a GCBR scenario, like working on the Biological Weapons Convention, that's going to be more large scale pandemics, right? But I just think that for there to be a lot of jobs and a lot of people working in this field, there needs to be a range of things that they can work on. I work on a range of different things, and, it allows me to work on GCBRs, but also have a foot in sort of the practical applications of some of these solutions in scenarios that, people are going to have to put into their pandemic plans, whatever, like actually what's happening in practice. And so I think that flexibility is important. But, that's not to say that there aren't things that are very specific to GCBRs, that I don't want to be being confusing people here.
Yeah, sure.
That's not the case.
Yeah, I guess that's true of the Biological Weapons Convention and anything to do with, I guess, like deliberate development of dangerous diseases for weapons purposes or something like that. That's very GCBR specific, and I guess could end up being very important or potentially not, depending on whether countries end up pursuing that.
Right. Yeah.
I suppose, GCBRs is kind of this niche within health security that we're especially excited about. But I suppose it's possible that there could be people who, in the long term, might want to work on GCBRs, but they won't be able to get a job in that niche right away. And so just going into health security in general could be as a good stepping stone to like potentially one day go and work on GCBRs if they think that's more effective. Does that sound right, kind of even now when it's potentially a growth industry?
Yeah, I think that, there are a lot of opportunities, and hopefully there will be a lot of opportunities in the future in health security. And so, just go get your feet wet. It might not be exactly the perfect thing that you're interested in spending all your time on GCBRs, but grow your experience. And, then, there are opportunities along the way that you can shift. But I don't think that there are many jobs right now that are just solely focused on GCBRs.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wrote an article a few weeks back called Good News About COVID-19, which was very popular because I guess maybe people were looking for some good news about the situation. Has there been any, good news in your views, like stuff that really indicates that things might not be as bad as they look on the surface?
Yeah, so I think some of the serology studies that have started to come out recently might indicate that, more people have gotten the disease, and they had it, maybe it was circulating earlier and not causing quite so much of a terrible disruption. I will admit that the sampling for those I'm not entirely sure about. And, some of the statistical methods have been questioned, but, it is possible that, maybe more people have had it than we thought. I think from a personal note, my husband had flu negative pneumonia in mid-February, and my son also had pneumonia a little bit before that. And so, if it's been circulating for longer, in the community, that could change a little bit of the dynamics of how we understand this disease.
Yeah, it's a funny situation when way more people have the illness than we think is the good news, but it does make sense because it means it's a lot less dangerous than we thought potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been intrigued by those results. I keep seeing these studies popping up on Twitter, and there's such conflicting results in different countries and using different methods and different kind of sampling approaches. It's an interesting mystery. It'd be a fun research project to try to unravel why is there kind of not a consistent picture being painted of how much this disease has spread.
Well, I think one of the things is actually that, the spread of the disease is hyperlocal here and actually around the world. And so while you might have a certain level of, infections across the country, that there may be differences in what is happening actually at the local level in cities and towns, counties, whatever, that there may be a huge amount of variation actually across the country. And so that and across the world. And so that may be why we have such different results. But the other thing that also could be happening is a difference in sampling. And so we know that the disease severity is different across different age groups. And so, if studies that are showing a huge number of asymptomatic people may actually be, I don't know about the age distribution there, but, I suspect that you have more asymptomatic cases with younger sample.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, there was a study recently in New York where I think they were sampling all women who were coming in to give birth at hospitals ahead of time, and they found that, was it 15% or something from memory had the condition, which is alarming. Although I suppose like New York, we know that it's been pretty widespread there. And I guess possibly pregnant women that have been coming into hospital related to the pregnancy, and perhaps they've been catching it there, or they've been forced to leave the house when other people have been in lockdown.
Yeah, so. I guess a pregnant woman is forced to leave the house to go to her prenatal appointments, but at the same time, you're really trying to cocoon yourself. And, the average age of this population is lower than, the Diamond Princess group,
Yeah. I guess with the arrival of the serology tests, it's been really interesting. They're very hard to interpret, as you were saying, because we don't know what the false positive rate is there. And so if you get, say, a result saying 2% of the population has this, and it's possible that the false positive rate is around 2%, and you really don't know how to read that result.
Right.
And so hopefully we'll get some more clarity on that in coming weeks and months as we get bigger testing of these kits with known negatives.
Yeah, larger sample sizes and probably, a way of sampling the population that pulls in a little more variation, or at least can differentiate by age group. I mean, these large, having a large sort of number for asymptomatic cases or from the serology or whatever, isn't that helpful if we don't know the age distribution or we don't incorporate it into our understanding of the age distribution?
Yeah. All right, well, that's all good news that maybe there's some signs that more people have it, and so not so many people dying. Well, I mean, I would be really happy to find that out.
Right, exactly.
I might be a little bit embarrassed because I've been skeptical of this theory on social media, so I might have to eat crow if that turns out to be true.
No, I mean, it could be completely wrong, and that's my possible. I'll call it my possible good news.
All right, we should probably wrap up. I know you've got a busy time trying to do COVID control. I'm kind of, as a final question, maybe curious to know, how has COVID affected your life personally? Are you guys at the CHS getting any sleep, or are you just kind of worked off your feet? And I'm not sure whether I mentioned earlier, but you were responding at 4 a.m. to our planning document for this interview, which made me worry about whether you were getting any rest at all, or whether you just maybe can't even sleep because you're just thinking about work all the time.
Yeah, well, I think that I might be sleeping more than a lot of other people at the center, but I was up in the middle of the night, trying to work on the notes here for this episode. Sometimes you just wake up and you're like, I could lay in bed and waste another hour just laying here, or maybe I should just get up and do something. So that's what was going on there. The workload has been really intense because, it's COVID-19, but then trying to keep up with, normal assistant professor activities. I'm teaching a class. I have students who need help. And my kids are at home with me. So,
playing kindergarten as well. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I'm glad to have a job. I'm glad to be busy, and I'm glad to have a nice family and a good situation. But I will say that it has been incredibly intense. Fortunately, I have, my husband can help, with being also the teacher, because they're doing, my son's doing online school, but he can't work a computer by himself because he's 5. And so it has been intense. But, this family time has also been, in many ways really nice, beyond the, the frustrations of trying to get through a mountain of work with your kids just climbing all over you. My daughter, who's 3, both of them have become obsessed with David Bowie, because they read this little book about him. And so they want to listen to David Bowie songs all the time. And my 3-year-old is singing Life on Mars all the time. And she loves that line. It was like, beating up the wrong guy. And she just loves singing that. So, I mean, there are moments where it is very funny to be, around them a lot. I do want them to go back to school, but, there are nice moments too.
Yeah, I guess there's the policy analyst side of do you want the schools to reopen, and then there's maybe the personal side as well, where
yeah, exactly.
Individual considerations could come in. Well, yeah, thanks so much for working so hard to protect us all from COVID-19 and I guess future pandemics as well. Yeah, to you and everyone at the Center for Health Security. I think the work you're doing is really impressive. My guest today has been Tara Kirk Sell. Thanks for coming on the 80,000 Hours podcast, Tara.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks for inviting me. This has been really great. I hope everyone has a good listen.
A reminder about the Effective Altruism Fund's website, which you can use to support the Center for Health Security, among other organizations that you might be interested in helping out. Here's 4 random book recommendations that you might like. I mostly listen to audiobooks, and these are all available on Audible. The first is The Story of Human Language by John McWhorter, which is a series of very entertaining lectures about how languages actually originated and how they really work. McWhorter is one of my favorite writers and always fun in the many interviews that he does. Second, there's Everybody Lies by Seth Stevens-Davidowitz. The premise is using our Google searches to learn things about us that we often won't readily admit in surveys, like how racist we are or what pornography we enjoy. It's a good premise to open with, but the book really makes the most of it, drawing out some good insights into what people are really like. Third, there's Climate Matters, Ethics in a Warming World by John Broome. It considers the moral philosophy of climate change and long-term impacts on the world in general, including an unusually informed treatment of population ethics, actually. While Broome is an academic philosopher, I found this one very engaging and easy to follow. Finally, there's Bolivar, American Liberator by Marie Arana. It's a really cracking book about how Latin America achieved independence from Spain, told through the story of Simón Bolívar, the general who led a series of really brutal campaigns across the entire continent to free Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Panama from colonial rule over a period of decades. According to Wikipedia, Bolívar fought 472 battles, of which 79 were important ones. And during his campaigns, he rode on horseback 123,000 kilometers, which is 10 times more than Hannibal, 3 times more than Napoleon, and twice as much as Alexander the Great. Not too shabby. All right, drop me an email if you end up reading and enjoying any of those. The 80,000 Hours podcast is produced by Kieran Harris, audio mastering by Ben Cordell, transcripts by Zachy Ulhack. Thanks for joining. Talk to you in a week or 2.